What do you do when being a good therapist feels like being a bad person? As therapists, we're taught to maintain strict boundaries and to act ethically at all times. So what do you do when a client invites you to their wedding, their graduation, or even asks you to speak at their funeral? Today, we're going to break down 3 different cases that bring up 3 different but similar ethical dilemmas and figure out if you should attend or not. Let's take a look at the ethical codes and find out. But first, my name is Keegan. I have a master's degree in counseling and I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor. Keep in mind that engaging with this channel does not constitute a therapist-client relationship. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes. This does not substitute or replace professional mental health care. Here's how this will go. We'll cover 3 different situations. With each new case, we'll bring in more ethical codes that might be relevant to the situation. We'll then talk through whether to attend or not, what the pros and cons might be, and other things that we're going to want to consider along the way. Let's begin with the case of Arlo. He's a client that the therapist has worked with for many years, and his primary struggle has been social anxiety disorder. He's made great progress in his treatment, to the point where he's been able to challenge his anxiety, was able to meet a partner, and they're now getting married. He hasn't invited the therapist to the wedding, but the therapist would like to attend to celebrate his hard work. They're sure that Arlo wouldn't mind, as he's commented on how thankful he is for their work together. The therapist's plan would be to only go to the ceremony and not to talk to anybody while they're there. After hearing this situation, do you have any immediate thoughts? Should the therapist attend Arlo's wedding? Of the 3 situations, this one would be the most clear-cut. I think that there's very little question here. The therapist should not attend Arlo's wedding. Not only would that break social norms, since the therapist wasn't invited to the wedding, but it's also pretty clearly crossing boundaries. In the American Counseling Association's 2014 Code of Ethics, Code A.6.b covers extending counseling boundaries. The ACA states, counselors consider the risks and benefits of extending current counseling relationships beyond conventional parameters. Examples include attending a client's formal ceremony, and in this case, Arlo's wedding would definitely be one of those. The ACA goes on to say, in extending these boundaries, counselors take appropriate professional precautions such as informed consent, consultation, supervision, and documentation to ensure that judgment is not impaired and no harm occurs. In Arlo's case, if the therapist attends the wedding without an invite, and without discussing this more with Arlo, they're extending the boundaries of the therapeutic relationship without Arlo's consent. Hearing this case, one of my first thoughts is that this is a situation where the therapist is struggling with managing their own reactions to the client. When we think about difficulties managing reactions to clients, we often think about those in a more negative context. However, we have to also consider that that can happen because of more positive reactions to people as well. This might be a situation where those more positive emotions and feelings toward the client might be getting in the way and potentially causing problems. Another relevant code here is B.1.b, respect for privacy. In this code, the ACA says, counselors request private information from clients only when it is beneficial to the counseling process. By attending a client's event without an invitation or a request from them for you to attend, this could then be seen as learning information about a client that they have not chosen to share with you. And ethically, that could be problematic. In this case, I can honestly not think of a situation where it would be appropriate to attend the wedding. Our next case isn't going to be as easy though. Here's the case of Quinn. She's a 17-year-old high school senior who had a difficult childhood. She experienced considerable abuse and was removed from her parents' custody when she was young. That is when she started working with her therapist. She recently invited her therapist to attend her graduation ceremony. She explained that it would mean a lot if the therapist attended, as the therapist has been one of the most consistent people in her life since she was young. Tougher, right? What do you think? Should the therapist attend? Let's first consider the ethical principle of non-maleficence. This is the principle that says we avoid harming clients. So we have to consider then, could there be harm to Quinn if the therapist were to attend? What could the harm be in that situation? I think the most obvious would be that if somebody found out what the therapist's role was in Quinn's life, that could potentially harm her. The harm could result from if the person asked Quinn why she sees this therapist, if they were wanting to know why she was wanting her therapist to attend her graduation ceremony, or if that person were to judge Quinn negatively for attending therapy. This is also hitting on code A.4.a, avoiding harm. With non-maleficence, we could think about this a different way too. We could ask, is there harm to Quinn if the therapist doesn't attend? Here, we might consider that Quinn does have a reasonable point. It is likely that the therapist has been the most consistent person for her throughout life, and that the therapist has probably played a pretty important role in her development and offering a sense of stability and safety in life. By attending the graduation ceremony, The therapist may help bolster Quinn's sense of self-worth. We could also consider how this is acting on the principle of beneficence, or doing good for the client. When we consider other possible harms to Quinn if the therapist doesn't attend, by not attending, the therapist does risk rupturing the therapeutic relationship. That's another component of this situation that should be considered. When we talked about Arlo's case, we discussed code A.6.b, which referenced extending counseling boundaries. In Quinn's case, it would be important to discuss with her what it would look like if the therapist were to attend the ceremony. It would be important for the therapist to also seek supervision and consultation related to this. And to keep consistent with code A.6.c, it would be important for the therapist to document these various interactions. We must also consider that Quinn is a minor. Therefore, consistent with section B.5 of the ACA's Code of Ethics, we have to consider to what extent a minor can give informed consent. This is likely going to be influenced by the laws of the place where the therapist is as well, so we have to consider those aspects too. But in many places, as a minor, Quinn would not be able to give informed consent, and instead, it would have to be the guardian who would give the informed consent. Here's a final code to consider for this case. In B.1.c, the ACA highlights the importance of respect for confidentiality. If a therapist were to attend, it would be important that they consider how they're going to respect Quinn's privacy in this situation. This might include only going to the ceremony and not attending any other sort of graduation party that she might have. It might include doing things like trying not to arrive to the ceremony too early and leaving shortly after the ceremony ends. This would also include the therapist not saying why they're there or who they're there for. In some places, graduates have a section reserved for the people that are important in their life. If that were the case for Quinn, it would likely include the therapist not sitting in that section and sitting with the general public instead. In Quinn's case, this is a situation where I could potentially see a therapist being able to attend in an ethical manner. However, there's many different parts of this that would need to be considered, thought through, and documented. And as you might guess, it's going to take a very specific situation for a therapist to be able to attend a client's event like this. What happens though if a therapist chooses not to attend, or if they're not able to attend for some other reason? If that were to happen in this situation, I think it would be important for the therapist to talk to Quinn about that and try to come up with an alternative plan instead. It might include something like working with Quinn to figure out if there's something that her and the therapist could do together in session to celebrate her graduation. There could be other things to do as well that might help. For example, maybe the therapist could write Quinn a card or a letter if that's something that she might find meaningful. So that's the case of Quinn. Now let's introduce some additional factors with the next case. But first, if you're enjoying this video and finding it helpful, please help me out by giving it a like and subscribing. For the third case, we have Iris. She's a 62-year-old female with a terminal case of cancer. She came to therapy for help managing the thoughts and feelings related to her terminal condition. She is not expected to survive more than a year. In preparation for end of life, she has asked her therapist not only to attend her funeral, but to actually speak at it. Iris explained that she would like to write a letter to her loved ones and wonders if the therapist would be able to read this as part of the funeral ceremony. In this case, the therapist is being asked not only to go into the situation, but to be placed in a position where they're front and center. Depending on how Iris might want this situation to play out, this could involve the therapist disclosing how she knows Iris. Many of the codes that we've discussed up to this point remain relevant, from non-maleficence and avoiding harm to beneficence and how this would be beneficial for Iris. We must continue to consider that this is a potential extension of the therapeutic relationship, taking care to thoroughly cover informed consent and documenting it. But let's bring in another principle from the Code of Ethics: justice. The ACA says that justice is treating individuals equitably and fostering fairness and equality. This means that we have to consider if this is something we would be able to do for other clients who are in a similar situation. We might also ask what's different about Iris's situation that might set it apart from other similar situations. Part of the idea with this principle is working through how you figure out how you're going to treat clients fairly. This might mean figuring out ways that you can go about treating all of your clients fairly, and so that you're showing up consistently with different clients. When we were discussing Quinn's case, we talked about how she may not be able to give informed consent as a minor. With Iris, we're going to want to consider something similar, specifically asking ourselves how her health condition might be impacting her ability to give informed consent. When somebody's ill or experiencing a terminal condition, this does not automatically mean that they can't give informed consent. However, there are times where a person's medical condition may impact their ability to do so. This is something we should consider when we're working with clients who have a medical condition or who are terminally ill, such as the case of Iris. But there's more here we'll want to consider. If the therapist were to read the letter at the service, it would be important to discuss with Iris how she would want the therapist to introduce themselves, what information they should share and what information she doesn't want them to share, and how and to what extent Iris would want the therapist to interact with others before and after the ceremony. In Iris's case, it's hard to say what the right answer is. I could see a possibility that there might be an ethical way to go about this, but I would want to understand why it is Iris wants the therapist to read the letter rather than somebody else. In my mind, there might be other options that could be more appropriate or meaningful, such as having a family member or friend or someone else that's important in Iris's life read that letter. Or maybe Iris writing the letter and then recording herself reading it to everyone and having that played at the ceremony. And this brings up another point. In situations like this, not only do we want to consider what to do with the situation, but we also want to think about other alternatives that we could bring up with the client and see if maybe those would actually work out better for them or be something that they'd prefer. Let's discuss some other considerations. We had 3 different cases. One where the therapist invited themselves to the client's event, one where the therapist was invited to attend, but that meant simply attending and not really having to engage with anybody, and a third case where the therapist was not only invited to attend, but asked to be very involved in the event. These help give us a range of ways of thinking about situations like this. But each situation can be so different and can bring up very unique challenges and considerations. So what are some other things that you could do if you were in a situation like this or involved in a situation that was similar but very different? In ACA Code I.1.b, they highlight the importance of using an ethical decision-making model. There are different, more formal decision-making models out there, and it could be helpful to find some of those and work your way through them. As a part of many of these models, and consistent with Code I.2.c, seeking consultation would be very important. This can be really helpful because then you have another set of eyes on the situation, another person thinking their way through it, and then you get another set of thoughts that may differ from your own. It may be possible to seek other ethical support as well. Not only would this include group consultation, but may involve supervision both individually and with a group. If you have malpractice insurance, they may have somebody on staff that you can speak with about ethical dilemmas and may also have legal resources available too. Some state boards may also have similar services available that you can utilize. So those are 3 different cases that present similar but different ethical dilemmas. Were there any other ethical codes that seemed relevant that I could have included? Let me know in the comments. I hope that you found this video helpful. While you're here, check out some of the other videos on my channel. Thank you so much for watching.